This podcast is sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Welcome to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Today we are interviewing Joseph Atwill. This is part 1 of 2 of this podcast. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Richard. How are you? Good morning, or good evening, I guess, there.
It's midday. Thank you for joining me. Would you like to commence?
Aren't I in
Yes.
at the moment?
Yes.
What do I need to do?
I would just ask you questions.
Right.
This is for my podcast, a Fish Out of Water podcast.
Right, of course.
Which is available on Substack. You're based in California. Have you lived in the US for most of your life?
Yes, most of my life I've lived in the US. I've also lived in Europe and South America, but spent my childhood in Japan primarily.
How long have you been writing for?
I started, well, my first book was Caesar's Messiah, but I'd actually been a writer almost my entire life. I first started to, my first occupation really was being a reporter in South America. Though that was entirely a failure, but that was my first attempt at employment. And so, following that, I tried to make money, different ideas, and eventually was involved in the creation of a software company that was very successful. I was able to sell it and invest in other things. And around about 1995, I returned to the things that I was sort of interested in, which were, various academic or, kind of pursuits that were like involved mainly with reading. I like to read. And one of the things that really interested me was the Dead Sea Scrolls. I was fascinated by them. I had been brought up a Catholic in a Catholic military school in Tokyo, St. Mary's Military, and so I was, deeply grounded in the Catechism and Catholicism and the history of Catholicism and Jesus, of course. And so the scrolls were amazing to me in that they seemed to be a diametrically opposite messianic movement. They were militaristic, xenophobic, and had literature which was genocidal in relation to the Gentiles, to the occupying army of Rome. So this didn't seem to me to be very similar to the turn the other cheek version of Christianity that I had been trained in as a child. And the question I tried to answer, Richard, was simply, did these two groups interact? And if so, how did they get along? Because it struck me that they would probably violently oppose one another. And Judea being a very small area, they had many of the same proof texts in their messianic theology. So they had to have been aware of one another. So there's really only one place to go to get a more informed understanding of the first century in Judea, and that's Josephus, which is unfortunate because he's basically a propagandist for the Roman imperial court. But nevertheless, that's all you have. There's really no other written source for information. And so reading Josephus, I started to realize that there were, in my opinion, there were passages that seemed to be a lampoon of Christianity, or perhaps a mockery of Christianity. And so this became an area of study of mine, of reading Josephus, seeing if perhaps there was a subtext that other scholars had missed. And I studied Josephus from that perspective. and found quite a few of these passages that seemed to be related to the Gospels. And then one day, for no particular reason, I noticed that all of the parallels that I was studying were occurring in the same sequence in both Josephus and the Gospels. And so at that point, I really thought I had a different way of understanding the Gospels. I did the analysis that became Caesar's Messiah. I wrote it originally in about 1995, and or at least the first bit of analysis. I put out a very small um, pamphlet, which was circulated somehow. I'm not even sure how it got to different scholars. One of them, particularly Robert Eisenman, who had written James, the brother of Jesus, had come across it. And he contacted me, and he basically encouraged me to put out a fuller analysis as a book and then helped me publish it. Um, Provided a very nice blurb for it. He's a very well known New Testament scholar. And so what I had actually put the analysis in my desk for 2 years because I was very troubled by it. I mean, I had no agenda against Christianity at that time. And I knew that some people would be very upset by it. But at the same time, I felt some guilt because I could see this was significant, and I didn't really. I mean, why would I, not produce this sort of analysis? And anyway, so I just I didn't really ever come to a conclusion about that, but I did eventually just put it out, hope for the best, and then the book just took on a life of its own. A documentary was made that was very successful. They would bring me around to do lectures in different places, and I would became kind of a minor talking head. I was on the BBC and CNN at this for a period of time. This was all very unpleasant. I have a privileged lifestyle. I'm well off, and I have no background in an academic situation. It just seemed unpleasant. But I also then, unfortunately, in a way, I was asked to do an analysis of Titus Andronicus, the Shakespearean play. Um, People had read it and were just because I had focused so much on Titus Flavius as having had prefiguration typology in the Gospels, basically directed toward his military campaign. I could explain this if you think your listeners would be interested in it.
Yes,
But
please.
anyway, I then did I did an analysis of Andronicus, and I could see that whoever wrote it was um, basically playing off of the Flavian typology in the Gospels. And so then I studied the Shakespearean literature for a bit, several weeks perhaps, and I realized who had written it and what the plays meant. I understood it was Jewish literature, and it was a mockery of the of Christianity, of the Gospels. Basically, the Shakespearean literature was a tip to stern response by a group. It was primarily this one woman, Amelia Bassano, had been the premier author, but others I certainly were involved in helping her. Anyway, so again, I didn't really know what to do with my analysis. I just wondered if this was really useful. But against better judgment, I did bring out the analysis, and I brought out Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. And so at that point, it was an unpleasant situation because I was not only dealing with Christian scholars and quite a few people who were supporting me. I mean, I had a great number of scholars that were you know realizing my analysis was correct and were promoting the work, but others were hating it. New Testament scholarship is a meager thimble world. There's no money in it. I mean, a best-selling book might do 5,000 copies, of an academic, critical kind of research book into New Testament scholar. And Caesar's Messiah was selling like 100,000 copies, So it was this very commercially successful piece, and the real New Testament scholars, in other words, those who had gotten PhDs, didn't like the fact that I was soaking up so much attention and Um, and it was strange, at least, I thought that they would be happy to have such clear analysis of the Gospels, but they were negating it. So this was taking quite a bit of time. And then when I brought up the Shakespeare work, this then became just another collection of individuals who were in opposition or supporting the work. But it was, because it basically at that point, my whole world was, I mean, there was like hundreds of emails and there was different criticisms and things. And I was dealing with all of this. And it wasn't, I didn't have sort of a passion for my work. I thought it was useful, but I didn't really want to spend my whole life doing it. However, I changed politically at a certain point because I became very suspicious of, it was after 9/11, um, so years after. I mean, when the event occurred, originally I thought nothing of it. I mean, other than it was a horrible, but I believed that the story given to me was correct. I didn't have any basis to doubt it. But at a certain point, I did analysis of the collapse of the building and was convinced that this was had all been orchestrated. And at that point, I changed politically, and then my work became, to me, more significant because it was a way to inform the public that the oligarchs used propaganda. Jesus, the history of Jesus was actually used by oligarchs for a political purpose. There was this idea of calming people down. There was the Messianic rebellions that were uh, one after another. There were three very large rebellions by Jews against the Roman Empire in this era, and so Jesus, part of the reason they wrote the Gospels was to produce a narrative, a history that would have a behavioral effect on Jews, and particularly Josephus mentions that they wanted to slow down the missionary activity. In the first century, Jews of Judea who were occupied, the region was occupied, they were doing missionary activity to Jews throughout the Roman Empire. And Rome was concerned about a empire-wide rebellion. And so this was part of the political reason. And anyway, yeah, I imagine you're aware of all this, but um, the um, the fact is that I thought that my analysis then of the Gospels was useful for the public in general because they could look at um, the way that history is presented to us as having potentially a propaganda aspect to it. We're not being told the truth. We're just being given information so that our behavior is controlled. And so then I was promoting the work in that way, and when other events would be occurring in the world, I would give my opinion to the media or to whoever was interested. That we really have to be aware that history has a particular effect in the mind. It creates this a capacity for belief in other things, and we just have to be so careful as a public about what we believe is history. And so I have stated that I believe we know more about the future than we do about the past, because the fact is that history has been basically occupied by the oligarchs. They've taken over, this phenomena, the recording of history, and so much of it has just been given to us with the aspects of propaganda involved in it, and this affects our thinking. It affects our what we accept as political coherency, um, and I think that now as we move into the world of artificial intelligence and all of this the kind of computer capacity to modify behavior, that if we're going to be a free species, we need to also the citizen needs to basically improve their skills, because certainly the oligarchs are. So if we are going to have any kind of way of resisting them, we need to have more skepticism, more use of logic. Um, you know, I really recommend that just replace belief with the Socratic method. try to always analyze events that are given with the idea that they need to be vetted carefully before you have belief. So that's me in a nutshell.
Interesting. Um, I'm wondering. You mentioned criticism throughout your works, throughout the
Yeah,
two publications. Can you give us some examples of criticisms and how you rebuted the criticisms?
sure. It's always relatively the same. The criticism would be they would take my work is made up of uh, it links passages in Josephus to passages in the gospel, and the the parallels are of different degrees of clarity. Some are literally the same things. Like, for example, Jesus predicts the Jerusalem being encircled with a wall, and Josephus records it. This isn't There's no contestation by scholars. Everyone knows that this is what Jesus is talking about. Jesus talks about the raising of the temple, not one stone atop another. So there's a number of events in a number of parallels which are beyond contestation. They are absolutely understood by everyone. But there are other parallels that are very oblique, and some of them will require actually like puzzle solving to be able to see the actual linkage. Um, you would only be able to sort of make that link if you were aware of the sequence. Sequence is the thing that New Testament scholarship simply did not take into account as being part of the way coherency the authors were developing their story with their real meaning. Anyway, so critics will take a single parallel and say that it's not it's not real. This is, in fact, one of the kind of critical words against me would be parallel mania. They would think it's a kind of extreme imagination. It's reading into the text things that aren't there. The parallels are not clear enough to be to demonstrate that it's deliberate linkage. And they are correct. There is no question that some of the parallels are very abstract. However, what is never done, and what I want to, if I want to, to silence a critic, I will point this out, is that you're not. This is not coherent criticism because you have to consider the sequence. Um, the the parallels, because there's, first of all, there's great many of the parallels that I show are either the same thing, like the encircling of Jerusalem with a wall, or they have been parsed over, they've been recognized by other scholars, and they've written about the parallelism, and they have there's books written about some of these different things, different parallels. But what they haven't seen is the sequence that's never been recognized before.
What do you mean by
And
sequence? Sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
What do you mean by sequence?
Well, the two texts, if you lay them side by side, the events that are typologically linked occur in the same order in both works, and the sequence is actually what enables you to recognize the more obtuse parallels. If you weren't trying to read the text with a certain bias at a certain point, you would not you certainly couldn't make the case that the parallelism was obvious and there was an obvious linkage. It's only when you're reading it as a sequence, which is established by uh, typologic links that are absolutely verbatim, you know. Um, they actually, oddly enough, there is at the very beginning, the very first page of the gospel, they give a primer. The authors of the gospels create a primer away in a pericope, in a very small section. They show you exactly how the gospels operate as literary construction. And if you don't mind, I'll just give this. even though this is,
Examples.
it requires a little bit of mental work for your readers. I'm sure everyone will be able to understand this, and this is so important to understand this. In Matthew, you have the story of Jesus's pre-ministry. Okay, and there Joseph has a dream. He realizes he has to leave Israel. He decides he's after the dream, he goes from Egypt. He goes down to Egypt. Then in Matthew 2:16, you have the passage that Herod massacres the boys, the children he was looking to see who the Messiah was going to come from. He massacres a boy. After a while, then Matthew 2:20, a divine person appears, an angel, and he says, he tells Joseph, they are dead who sought the child's life. And then you have the return from Egypt to Israel. Joseph takes the family back there. And then in Matthew 3:13, Jesus is baptized. He passes through water. He now goes into the wilderness. I mean, I'm sure your people who are Christian will recognize the story. He goes into the wilderness for 40 days. Okay. And there's the three temptations in the wilderness, and you have the quotes of, Jesus is tempted by bread. The Israelites, they're told, do not tempt God. And then in 4:10, it says, worship. Remember, the Israelites are instructed to worship only God. Okay, so that is the pre-ministry of Jesus, and it is taken as history by many people. In fact, there are actually fictional conjectures concerning, Jesus's life in Egypt. However, it is all fiction, and it is demonstrably so because the entire story was taken from the Old Testament, right? In the Old Testament, now this is what's called typologic prefiguration. So it's not verbatimism. The passages are obviously not the same, but they are clear enough so that you can see that the author of Matthew is indicating that Jesus's life was prefigured by Moses, and therefore, like Moses, he is going to be a savior of Israel. Because in Genesis 45, Joseph has dreams and decides that he needs to go from Israel to Egypt. Exodus 1, the Pharaoh massacres the boys. Exodus 4, the divine person comes and says, all the men are dead who sought the child's life. Exodus 12, you return from Egypt to Israel. Exodus 14, the Israelites pass through water. I'm going to return to this parallel when I'm done. Then the Israelites go into the wilderness, same location, but for 40 years. Not Jesus does 40 days. And so this is not verbatimism, but obviously there is parallelism here. The number 40 is given. But now you have a complete clarification because the quotes that are given in Matthew are created here. Exodus 16, the temptation by bread. Exodus 17, do not tempt God. Exodus 32, worship only God. So what has happened is that the author of Matthew has used names, locations, and concepts from the Old Testament in the same sequence, right? The same sequence. So here is to answer your question concerning determination of the parallels. You have in Exodus 14 you have the passing through water, and in Matthew 3:13 you have Jesus's baptism. Now, at first glance, there is absolutely no way they can be parallel. You have Jesus in one version of the story. He's not in the same location. He's in the River Jordan. And the parallel would be the Israelites passing through the Red Sea. However, there is the concept that both groups are passing through water at this point. And more important, the author of Matthew, he actually takes a statement out of Egypt I have called my son, which occurred in Exodus 14, and puts it into Matthew 3:13, so that even though you have it's very obtuse, the statement taken right from Exodus 14 and inserted into Matthew 3:13 completely clarifies what that they are linked. Now, the fact that you would read it with that bias, looking for this kind of parallelism, is established by the sequence. If you know the overall sequence of the story, you would be looking in that point for something to do with water. And then you would start to parse through it and then notice that once a sentence had been taken from Exodus 14 and 3:13. So my point is that to see typologic prefiguration requires looking at the entire story that is the concept is contained within. And no one had been reading the Gospels in this way, even though the analysis I just gave and concerning the pre-ministry of Jesus, even though I was forced to, because it's so little known, I had to do this analysis myself, which was laborious to try to figure this out. But it other scholars had noticed it, and it really has profound significance, Richard, because this shows that the story of Jesus is fiction. All right, now prefiguration typology, where the Old Testament is used as the basis for
Sorry to
Jesus's
interrupt.
pre-ministry. I'm sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. You're assuming
Oh,
that
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be long-winded.
Sorry, that's okay. You're assuming that the story is fiction, but do we have evidence that it is not fiction, including the Bible itself? Where is the evidence for the truth?
Right. Well, you get into what you mean by evidence. The fact is that you can show where the story of Jesus came from, and it comes from another story. So the author is what? It's a very good question. What you can show is that the author is not using events from or does not need to use. This is a better way of explaining it. Does not need to use history as the basis for his story. He can create the pre-ministry of Jesus, and you can show that he has simply created it out of the Old Testament. So as far as to the degree of certainty that you're questioning, one can take all of the gospel as miraculous, and there you go. You just that would be how would that be disproven? But I would think it's more parsimonious, given that you have a the there is another story that these events were taken from. This is the stronger case can be made that this is simply a kind of fiction, that the author of Matthew is um, was not aware of these as historical events, but simply was creating prefiguration out of the Old Testament. It's just much more coherent.
Who was the author of Matthew?
Well, no one knows. The the Gospels, particularly the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I think the Gospels were created in the Flavian court. They would have had a team of specialists in Jewish literature. The Gospels show a very high degree of understanding of Jewish literature. And they also have a number of words which are found really only within the imperial cult. The imperial cult was the largest Roman bureaucracy in this era. It basically was a propaganda device to give the impression that there were divine aspects to Caesar, and therefore he should be obeyed. This was the imperial cult. This is this large Roman bureaucracy, and it had its own vocabulary. Many of these words end up in the Gospels. So whoever writes Matthew,
for example, can you give an example? Sorry.
Well, Gospel itself, Evangelion, it's directly related to, or is used often within the imperial cult literature, indicating that it is the good news of a victory of Caesar, right? Of a divine conquest by Caesar, and then it is reused by the author of Matthew, or by the creators of the New Testament, as indicating the ministry of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus Christ. But so the as one example. But the thing is, whoever is creating this literature has this combination of skills. There is a kind of you could make a list of attributes of the author, of what he is aware of, to be able to produce it. And in the Flavian court, you had a very deep understanding of Jewish literature because, well, first of all, the historian Josephus lived there, who claimed to be a Jewish priest. But moreover, the family of the Alexanders. Philo Alexander was the most famous Jewish intellectual of the era. And his nephew was actually a general of the Flavian army during the siege of Jerusalem. So the Alexanders and the Flavians had a generation, many generations of connections. And so these individuals had I've said that rather than it being far-fetched that the Flavians produced the Gospels, they are actually the first candidates, because it's only there that you have motivation, capacity, and opportunity. I mean, in order to produce the Gospels, you needed to want to produce the story of a pacific Jewish Messiah.
I have a big question here.
Yes, Coach. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Have you actually seen the original texts
Of Matthew?
Flavius and of Matthew? Do they exist? Where can they be found?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The first, the oldest gospel, I think, would be Vaticanus, which would be at the beginning of the 4th century. That would be the oldest copy that exists of the New Testament. And Josephus, I don't think there are any copies older than the 8th century. So that would be, what we have in the ways of historical documents. The Flavians are linked into Christianity very early on by the original saints of. If you look in the Catholic Encyclopedia, they actually have a whole criteria called the Flavian saints, or the Christian Flavi, and these are all relatives of the Roman Caesars who were in the Flavian family, and these are the very first saints of the Catholic Church. So it's very suspicious that you'd have so many of the imperial family would be the very first Christian saints. But all we have really is the text, and I call the the analysis that I do the Flavian signature. It was what they were very interested in legacy. If you read the book, you'll see that, oddly enough, even though the Gospels are always used and have been regarded as historical literature or religious literature, actually they are a legacy literature. They really were written to create ultimately the understanding that the Flavians had the genius to produce this religion and control their subjects in this way. If you drive around Rome, you'll see just in great many structures, physical structures, which proclaim the divinity of the Flavians or of the Roman Caesars. I mean, for example, if you go to the Arch of Titus, you'll see carved right onto the edifice the god Vespasian and the son of God Titus. Right, the Romans had the Caesars had established themselves as human gods, and on the arch you'll have a great many of, well, there's representations of the destruction of Jerusalem that Jesus, envisioned. So the Gospels, from that perspective, are really just a literary form of the imperial cult. It's just a way of representing Caesar, because and this would probably, for people listening who haven't read the book, I would have to point out that the typologic prefiguration in the Gospels that I represent gives the identity of the Son of Man that Jesus claims will come in 40 years and destroy the temple, right? So what the Gospels are really saying is that the character that Jesus is pointing to in the future, who will come in 40 years, um, that individual has a name. It isn't given in the Gospels. You have to use the typologic prefiguration to understand the name. But that's the entire reason that the Gospels are written, really, is to give you the identity, the actual name of the person who is called the Son of Man that Jesus is predicting is going to come in 40 years. And the prefiguration written in the Gospel shows that it's this Roman Caesar. Yeah, that's why the in terms of, well, who wrote it, and what are the autographs, that we can see and understand. There just really aren't any. All what they've left us is just the literature itself and a system inside the literature to identify the people who created it.
Very interesting. I'm wondering whether you might have another 20 minutes or so to...
Yeah, I got all the time you want, buddy.
Perfect.
It's 4:30 here. I'm just getting going for the day, so I'm fine.
Perfect. Can I call you back in 10 minutes? I'll send you another link.
Sure. Of course.
Thank you. This podcast is sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Thank you for listening to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Should you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please get in touch.